The child's voice, when it finally came, was so quiet that Vesna thought she had imagined it. She had been kneeling on the stone floor of the nursery alcove, folding the last of her things into a worn leather satchel, moving carefully so the buckle would not scrape the flagstone and wake whoever slept in the inner room. The order of reassignment had come the day before, delivered by the steward's third clerk, not the steward himself, which told her something about how the matter had been classified. Administrative correction. The outer ward, effective the following morning. She had not been surprised. She had been given 6 weeks more than she had any official right to, and she had understood, when she read the reassignment slip, that someone had noticed and decided not to comment on the discrepancy. She did not know who. She had folded the slip into her notebook and gone on with the evening. Now it was gray dawn, and she was kneeling on stone and packing her thread kit, and the sound came from behind her like something dropped from a great height into still water. Her name. She went still, her thumb pressed against her forefinger, a small, invisible gesture, the way it always moved when she was deciding something. The carved wolf sat on the shelf above the small bed, the way it always had. Oak, worn smooth from 3 years of handling, the left ear re-stitched with a thread of dark amber she had sourced from her own kit 6 weeks before. Its replacement had held. She had checked it each morning, the way you check a repair you are not entirely certain of, until she became certain. The nursery was barely light. The fire in the outer room had burned to embers. The boy was sitting up in his small bed, both hands around the wolf, his dark hair pressed flat on one side from sleep. He had his mother's eyes, gray-blue, with the particular quality of light that the late queen had possessed, a quality Vesna had only seen in portraits, but recognized nonetheless. He was looking at her with an attention that was not the blank, unreachable stillness she had come to know across 9 weeks of unofficial mornings. This was different. This was deliberate. He said her name a second time, clearer now, as though the first attempt had been a test of the mechanism, and this was the full use of it. "Yes," she said, because she did not know what else to say, and she was not yet convinced she was not still asleep on her outer word palette. "Yes, I'm here." He held out the wolf. She crossed the alcove and took it from him, ran her thumb along the stitching at the mended ear, the way he always waited for her to do. The thread was intact. She handed it back. He examined her examination of it with the focused satisfaction of someone whose trust has been confirmed by evidence. And then he put the wolf carefully on the bed beside him and lay back down. The duty nursemaid appeared in the doorway 3 minutes later, carrying a candle that she did not appear to need, and stopped. She looked at the boy, then at Vesna, then at the satchel on the floor. Then she turned and went to find someone who should know. Vesna stayed. She was still kneeling on the stone when the sun cleared the slit window. She had been in the castle for 3 years and a season. No one remembered quite when she had arrived. That was a deliberate achievement, the kind that takes discipline and a specific understanding of how invisibility works. It is not about absence. It is about presence at a frequency so consistent that the eye stops registering it as event and begins registering it as furniture. She had come to the castle as a lower quarter placement, carrying a ledger she had been handed at the border post, and a work assignment that said, in the language of administrative brevity, Outer ward, miscellaneous domestic, and no one had looked at her long enough to ask anything further. She kept the linen tallies. She repaired things. She appeared when something needed doing and withdrew before the thanks arrived, which suited her, and suited, she suspected, the castle's broader understanding of what an Omega's proper relationship to thanks should be. The castle was a thing of stone and ceremony, built for the performing of hierarchy, and it performed it without pause. The great hall ran east to west along the castle's spine, all dark timber and torch iron, and the smell of wood smoke and expensive candle wax. The council chamber sat above it, the private apartments above that, and below all of it ran the corridors and working rooms where the castle actually functioned, the laundry, the lower kitchens, the storerooms, the outer ward, the places that sustained the ceremony above them and were not invited to witness it. Vesna had learned the castle from the inside out, the way you learn a language by living in it rather than studying it, until she knew every corridor by the quality of its cold, and every room by what it smelled of in the morning. She had not intended to know the nursery wing. The nursery wing was 2 floors up and 3 corridors removed from anything her assignment required her to be. She had learned it by accident, the way certain things are learned, by being present at a moment that had not been scheduled. The Alpha King's queen had died in the deep cold of a winter morning, 18 months before Vesna's 2nd year in the castle began. The death had moved through the building the way a change in weather moves, not announced, simply felt, a shift in the pressure of the air that every living thing in the structure noticed before the bells rang. She had been loved. That was the specific quality of the grief Vesna had felt around her for weeks afterward, not the impersonal sorrow of subjects mourning a symbol, but the intimate grief of people who had been in the same rooms as someone, and now could not stop noticing all the places she was not. The king did not return to public function for 6 weeks. When he did, he was the same in all the ways that could be measured, and different in the ways that could not. He was still tall, still dark, still the kind of man who occupied a room without appearing to work at it. He still did not raise his voice. He had simply become someone who carried more than he had before, without adjustment to his gait, and the castle had arranged itself carefully around the weight of this, without discussing it. His son was 2 years old when his mother died. His name was Rowan. He had dark hair, and his mother's grey-blue eyes, and he had not said a single word since the morning of her death. The court physicians attended him. Specialists were summoned from the outer territories. A physician from the capital stayed for 3 weeks and departed without explanation or invoice. Nursemaids were hired and rotated. The rooms were changed. Nothing changed. Rowan ate what was placed before him, walked when taken by the hand, slept when put in his bed, and made no sound. He was 3 years old now, and the silence had been a settled fact for 14 months and 11 days. Vesna had found her way to the nursery wing on a Tuesday in her 2nd autumn, delivering the linen tallies to the upper floors, taking a wrong turn in the east corridor. She had taken the wrong turn before, and suspected in later reflection that she had not taken it by accident even then. The nursemaid on duty had fallen asleep in the outer room with her chin on her chest. Vesna had put the linen tallies on the table and turned to go, and found herself instead standing in the doorway of the alcove, looking at a boy who was sitting in the middle of a cold stone floor with a carved wooden wolf in both hands, and the specific stillness of someone who has been still so long They no longer remember what the alternative felt like. She sat down on the floor. She took her mending kit from her left pocket, the thread, the small bone needle, the bit of wadded cloth she used for pressing seams, and she mended a seam on the cuff of her own sleeve that she had been meaning to mend for 2 weeks. She did not look at him directly. She did not speak. She was simply there, occupying the floor alongside him, and he looked at her for a long time with his gray-blue eyes, and then looked back at the carved wolf, and by the time the nursemaid woke, Vesna had finished the seam, and was halfway through an inventory of the nursery's linen needs, which she had assessed by quiet examination. And Rowan had moved from the floor to the low bench by the window without anyone touching him or asking him to. She came back the following Tuesday, then the Tuesday after. Then she began coming on other days, too, at the end of her ward shifts, at the gray hour before dawn deliveries. She did not announce this. She did not ask for an assignment. She simply came, and she brought her mending, and she sat, and the boy adjusted to her presence the way small creatures adjust to the particular human who has not yet frightened them. She kept a notebook, a small leather-bound thing she carried in her left pocket beside the thread kit. She had always kept records. It was a habit that predated the castle, rooted in a childhood understanding that the things not written down were the easiest to lose. The notebook had columns and dates and brief notations: how much Rowan ate, when he slept without waking, whether he kept the carved wolf in his hands or placed it on the shelf. She did not write it to report. She wrote it because what she was noticing felt important enough to be real, and writing it down made it real. Week 4 of her unofficial visits. He moved to the window bench without prompting for the first time, sat there for 20 minutes looking at the inner yard. I did not comment. Week 7. He placed the wolf on the shelf himself this morning, instead of leaving it on the floor. Deliberate. He stood and looked at it afterward, as if checking the logic of the decision. Then he went back to the bench. Week 9. He carried the wolf to me first, did not release it until I had run my thumb along the stitching of the mended ear. Then he placed it on the shelf himself. He is tracking whether I am paying attention. The wolf's ear had first broken in her 5th week. The original thread, a thin gray cord, official castle supply, had frayed through at the joint. She had replaced it with amber thread from her own kit, a color she had never seen used in the castle's standard inventory. She mended it in the alcove while Rowan slept, without announcing it, and the following morning he had picked it up and examined the ear with the focused attention of a craftsperson reviewing work that has been done in their absence. Then he had placed it back on the shelf and eaten all his porridge. She had noted it in the notebook. He had not spoken a single word in 14 months and 11 days, but his hands had remembered how to trust something first. The news traveled through the castle the way news of something impossible always travels, in a whisper that grew louder the further it moved from the source, and arrived at each destination already changed by the distance. By the time it reached the council chamber, it had lost its specificity and gained the quality of held breath, the sound a room makes when something has shifted and no one has yet found their footing in the new arrangement. Cormac was halfway to the east wing before his second had finished the sentence. He had no clear memory of deciding to move. That was the wolf, the part of him that operated below deliberate thought, that had been pulling at him for 3 days, like a rope tied to something he couldn't see. He had attributed the restlessness to poor sleep, to the council sessions which had been running past the evening bell. He had attributed it to everything except the most accurate explanation, which was that the wolf had been noticing something he had not yet allowed himself to notice, and had been making its opinion known in the only language it possessed. The nursery alcove smelled of stone and cold linen and something else, warm, specific, impossible to categorize in any of the systems the court had given him for categorizing things. He stood in the doorway and looked at his son. Rowan was sitting on the low bench by the window, the carved wolf in both hands. He was looking at Vesna with the careful attention he had not given to anything or anyone in 14 months and 11 days. She was kneeling on the floor with her satchel in her lap, and something in her posture, a quality of complete stillness, unhurried, like someone who understands that the only correct response to something delicate is patience, that made the word found present itself in Cormac's mind without his invitation. Something tightened in the base of his sternum. He could not have named it. Master Eloise arrived an hour later. She was the castle's keeper of records and historical accounts, a small, gray-haired woman of 70, who had been compact and dry-voiced since before Cormac could remember, and would, he suspected, remain so until she chose otherwise. She carried 3 volumes under one arm, with the ease of someone who had been carrying 3 volumes since childhood, and saw no reason to find it inconvenient. She spread them on the nursery's outer table, and read in a silence that the room correctly understood to be working silence, and not an invitation for commentary. The duty nursemaid stood near the door. Vesna stood near the window. Cormac stood in the doorway between the 2 rooms, because standing in the alcove itself had felt like an intrusion he had not earned. Eloise turned a page, then another. Then she said, without looking up, 14 months and 11 days. No one had given her the count. She had arrived with it already. The grief silence in the Alpha bloodline is not a medical condition, she said. The physicians were never going to find it, because they were looking for something broken. There is nothing broken. It is older than medicine. She set one hand flat on the open page. The last recorded case in a child of the Alpha line was in the time of the 3rd Cormac, your great-grandfather's era. The boy stopped speaking after a significant loss. He was silent for 2 years before speaking again. The physicians at that time noted no organic cause. She closed that volume and opened the second. Before that, she said, there is one further record. The room waited. A pup of the bloodline. 307 years ago. She looked up, directly at the king, with the precision of someone delivering a figure that has been checked and rechecked and will not be adjusted to suit the room's comfort. 307 years, an omega in the household service. She is not named in the account. The record was kept by a lord who saw no reason to name an omega. What it says is this: the pup had not spoken in 8 months. The omega's presence in the nursery quieted him. He spoke within the season. She was removed from service the following week. She paused. The account notes that after her removal, the child did not speak again for 2 more years. Vesna's thumb pressed against her forefinger. 307 years, Heloise said again, the way she said all numbers, with the respect due to something that had waited that long to be relevant. The order of reassignment had been signed before the morning's events. This fact was not disputed. The steward confirmed it. The clerk who had delivered the slip confirmed it. The document bore its date and signature in the correct sequence. It had been signed, and it stood, and Vesna returned to the outer ward that evening with her satchel and her notebook and her thread kit, and the particular quality of composure that belongs to people who have learned over a long time that the things they build without authorization tend to be removed by the people who make the rules. She did not go back to the nursery wing. She kept writing. Day 2 after reassignment. He ate all his porridge, the nursemaid says. He has kept the wolf in his hands all morning. He placed it on the pillow beside him when he slept. She wrote it down because writing it down made it real. She still had no one to give the notebook to. Cormac began appearing in the east corridor, not in the nursery, not near it, not conspicuously adjacent to it. The east corridor ran parallel to the nursery wing's outer wall, separated by 2 stone spans and a service passage that no one of consequence used. It had nothing of interest in it. The morning deliveries from the outer ward came through on their way to the upper stores, and the light through its east-facing windows was good at the hour just after the morning bell, and neither of these things would have been reason enough for the Alpha King to be there, standing at a window with his hands clasped behind his back, watching the inner yard, when she came through with the ledger on a Thursday. She gave him the correct acknowledgment, the small bow of the head, the continued walking, and he said nothing until she was almost past, and then said, "How long were you in the nursery wing?" She stopped. She had spent 3 years learning how to look at people of rank, directly, but without challenge, the eyes meeting the chin rather than the eyes, a form of contact that satisfied the requirement of attention without implying a claim. She looked at him this way. He was looking at her differently, with the quality of attention that required something from the person giving it, the kind that cost something to sustain. His amber-gold eyes had a quality in certain lights of appearing to shift in temperature, warmer or cooler, depending on what they were considering. They were warm now in the morning light, and very steady. "I was officially assigned for 8 months, she said. Then my assignment ended. Then I kept coming on my own time for 6 weeks after that." "Why?" It was not phrased as a question. It was the shape of a question, with the inflection of someone who already suspected the answer and was testing whether the answer would be given honestly. "Because he was better when I was there," she said. "I noticed it in the 4th week, and I kept records to be sure." She paused. "I kept coming because the records confirmed it." His eyes dropped to the ledger under her arm, then to the specific outline in her left pocket, notebook-shaped, unmistakable to anyone who had been looking. Then back to her face. "He has not spoken again since that morning," he said. "No," she said, "but he is asking for the wolf." A pause. "The nursemaid said he keeps checking the ear," he said. "He trusts the repair," she said. "He will keep checking until he stops needing to." Something moved across his face, not an expression exactly, more the shadow of one, the kind that passes when a person arrives at a conclusion they had not expected to arrive at, and takes a moment to understand its implications. He left without further word. He was back the following morning. He had, in the intervening day, reviewed the nursery's supply manifest. She did not know this until later, and even then she learned it only obliquely. What she knew in that second morning was that he was looking at her with the quality of a man who has read something 4 times and is now meeting the subject of the reading, and that the something had changed the nature of his attention in a way she could not categorize. He handed her the day's council summary to cross-reference against the archive ledger, and when she took it from his hand, his finger did not release the paper immediately. 1/2 second, perhaps less. The warmth of it was specific and brief, and neither of them acknowledged it. And she finished the cross-reference and returned the summary to the steward's office and stood in the empty service passage for a moment, with her hand against her own sternum, listening to her heartbeat do something unreasonable, and told herself it had been an accident until she was alone enough to admit it hadn't. Lady Ingrid was the keeper of court protocol. She had held the position for 11 years and had built it into something considerably more architectural than its original brief, so that now it encompassed not merely the scheduling of ceremonies, but the social grammar of the court itself. Who stood where, who addressed whom, and in which form, who was accorded which grade of acknowledgment in the corridor, and who was not. She was silver-haired, sharp-shouldered, and possessed of the absolute certainty of someone who has written the rules and has no intention of revising them. She moved through the great hall the way a blade moves through water, cleanly, leaving the water shaped differently after. Her second petition was filed in the 3rd week of the new month. The first had been the reassignment order, administrative, precise, and exercise in using the correct mechanism. The second was the formal council hearing, and it was built with the same precision on a stronger foundation. An Omega of the lower quarter had accessed the royal nursery wing without official assignment for a documented period of 6 weeks. This had been confirmed by 3 separate nursemaids and cross-referenced against the entry log. The relevant protocols, numbers 7, 12, and 19 of the Household Access Regulations, were cited in full, with the year of their establishment and the specific reasoning behind them. The medical opinion of the court physician was appended, noting that unauthorized contact with a grief-affected child of the bloodline could constitute an interference with established healing procedures. The petition sought permanent removal from the castle grounds. It was formally correct in every particular. It was designed by someone who understood that an institution could not defend itself against its own rules, and that the most elegant form of removal was the one that required nothing extraordinary, only the routine operation of a system that had always been built to favor the people who built it. Vesna read the summary in the outer ward on a cold bench, with the paper flat on her knee and her thumb pressing against her forefinger. She did not run. She had not run from anything in 3 years, and she was not going to begin with this. She opened her notebook, and she kept writing. What Cormac did 3 days before the formal hearing was not announced. He did not tell his steward the reasoning. He submitted a supplementary document to the council record, a supply manifest review covering the nursery's maintenance inventory over the preceding 3 months. The review noted, in the language of administrative inventory, a thread supply discrepancy. 1 spool of dark amber thread, not a standard castle supply color, sourced from the outer ward's personal property inventory and used for documented nursery item repair. The manifest entry named the item repaired, one carved oak toy, left auricular attachment, and the source of the material, lower ward staff inventory, specific individual identified. The entry was in the council record before the formal hearing convened. His steward noted it without comment. His steward had served him for 7 years and had learned that the king's administrative interventions could be trusted to mean something, and that asking about them was not part of the job. It was not enough to dismiss the petition. It was enough to make her visible in the record, specifically in the document the council would review. He had not been able to explain to himself precisely why that mattered as much as it did. He did the thing and said nothing about it to anyone and went back to the border assessments. On the evening before the hearing, Vesna was carrying the linen returns across the inner yard when she noticed the council chamber window lit. The session had closed at the evening bell. The yard was empty. She stopped. She could see him through the high window, not clearly, distance and glass and angle conspiring against clarity, but enough. He was standing at the far end of the chamber, alone, with Rowan against his chest. The boy was not asleep. He was not awake in the active sense either. He had the quality of a child who has found the exact configuration of another person that makes the world negotiable and has decided to stay in it. Cormac was not reading. He was not reviewing anything. He was simply standing in the room that administered the territory he ran, and holding his son in the still, deliberate way of someone who has determined that holding is the only available thing, and has decided that it is enough, even though it costs something to decide it. He had no audience. There was nothing performed about any of it. The tiredness was in his posture, not weakness, nothing approaching collapse, but the specific quality of tiredness that belongs to someone who carries a significant weight over a significant distance and does it without adjusting their expression. She had thought him cold. She had thought him the kind of man who generated obedience so reflexively that he had never needed to develop warmth as a separate skill, and that the loss of his queen was something he was managing the way he managed everything else, through function, through the correct application of discipline, through refusing the room any view of the interior. She had been wrong. He was not cold. He was a man managing something enormous, alone, in the room that was supposed to be for managing the world, and the cost of it was visible in the only moment he was not being watched. Or so he believed. She went back to the outer ward. She did not speak to him. She carried what she had seen through the next 2 days alongside her notebook and her thread and her pressed thumb, and did not know what to do with it except not to put it down. The formal hearing was held in the Great Hall's antechamber on a Tuesday morning. The room was ranked. Council lords on the left dais, Ingrid and her testimony witnesses ranged along the near wall, the presiding lord at the high end with his register open. It was the architecture of institutional judgment, designed to communicate, through the arrangement of bodies in space, who held the determining authority. Vesna entered with her notebook in her left hand and the carved wolf in her right, borrowed from the nursery with the nursemaids' bewildered but unchallenged permission, and stood in the center of the room in her gray-brown dress, and did not look at anyone for permission to begin. She presented her records. 9 weeks of dated entries read aloud in the level, even voice she used for ledger work, not because she was not nervous, but because there was no advantage to performing the nervousness, and some advantage to the room understanding that she was operating from evidence rather than emotion. The entries were specific, dates, times, behaviors noted, and cross-referenced against the days she had not come, which she had also noted. The correlation was not subtle. It was the kind of correlation that appears in records kept by someone who is not trying to prove something, but has made the error of noticing everything. She placed the notebook on the council table. She placed the carved wolf beside it. She described the mended ear, the original gray thread, the fraying, the amber replacement sourced from her own kit, the boy's response. She described how he had held the wolf out to her for the first time in week 9, not to hand it over, but for examination, to check whether she had understood what the ear signified. She described the morning of the speaking, the packing of her satchel, the quality of the light, the specific silence of a room that was about to stop being silent. The presiding lord read her notebook. He read the thread manifest entry, Cormac's addition to the record, without comment, though she noted the moment his eyes paused on it, and the moment they moved to the Alpha King of the side of the room, and the moment they moved back to the notebook without having received anything from Cormac's expression, because Cormac's expression was not in the business of giving things to council lords who looked for them. Ingrid's counter-argument was organized and entirely correct in its procedural logic. The access violations were documented. The protocols existed for specific reasons. And Omega's presence in the royal nursery without sanctioned assignment represented exactly the kind of informal, uncategorized access that the regulations were designed to prevent. Sentiment and outcomes were separate matters from authorization and process. It was the argument she had built for this room, and it was a good argument, and Vesna knew it. The door of the outer corridor opened. The castle's old physician, not the court physician who had testified for Ingrid, but the woman who had attended the late queen and been quietly sidelined since the funeral, entered with a document that she placed on the council table with the decisiveness of someone who has been waiting 2 months for the correct moment to put something down and is relieved to have arrived at it. The document was a supply requisition from the nursery bath preparation ledger, a recurring line item added 10 months prior, 3 weeks after Ingrid had been appointed to oversee the nursery rotation. A specific compound categorized in the supply records as a calming agent for household use, with a secondary application documented in wolf pack management literature. It suppressed the formation of new scent attachments in developing pack members. In a wolf pup, or in a grief-silenced child of the bloodline, it would cause no harm. It would simply ensure that no new attachment formed to replace the one that had been lost. The presiding lord read the document twice. He asked the court physician to explain the compound. The court physician said he had no knowledge of it. The bath preparation ledger was produced. The authorization signature on the supply line was located, and it was Ingrid's. And that was the end of the argument about authorization and process. Ingrid said nothing. She was too intelligent to say anything. She had built the institution, and she understood what it looked like when the institution was finished with you. The petition was struck. The vote was unanimous. Vesna gathered her notebook from the council table. She picked up the carved wolf. She turned toward the door. The room emptied around her in the way that rooms empty after decisions, quickly, with the specific directional energy of people who have finished one thing and need to begin another. She was the last one at the table, except for the Alpha King, who had been standing at the far wall through all of it, watching. He took a step toward her. She turned, and her notebook was against her chest, and her thumb was pressed against her forefinger, and she looked at his face and saw that he was about to say something that was not a council matter, not a supply audit, not a question about authorization, something in the particular register of a man who has arrived by a longer route than anticipated at the sentence he has been forming for several weeks, and has found himself, finally, in a room empty enough to say it. She waited. His captain knocked once and opened the door without waiting. A border report, urgent, requiring the king's immediate attention, and registered the room's population and paused, and the pause was long enough for everything in it to close. Cormac held her gaze for one additional second. Then he turned to the captain, and Vesna walked out of the antechamber, and neither of them knew how to find their way back to that particular sentence. She stood in the corridor for a moment with the carved wolf in her hands, and the cold of the stone floor coming up through her thin-soled shoes, and then she walked back to the outer ward. Ingrid's formal removal from her position was processed in a single week. Her actions with the compound were reviewed by the palace physician, a thorough examination conducted with the impersonal rigor that serious things deserve, and determined to have caused no permanent harm. The child's silence had not been worsened by it. It had simply been extended by a mechanism designed to ensure that the silence remained in a form Ingrid could manage. The formal record stated the conclusion. Ingrid was escorted to the administrative holding rooms while a transfer was arranged. The transfer was to a settlement in the far north of the territory, at sufficient distance from the capital that it had no political significance and a great deal of winter, and Cormac arranged it himself without delegation. "I want her to have a long time to think about it," he said to his second when the transfer order was finalized. His second acknowledged this without comment. "And I am tired of things ending in fire." His second, who had served him for 7 years, made a note that this was the most words the king had said consecutively on a non-military topic in recent memory, and filed the observation away under the category of things that were not his business. The court physician, who had testified for Ingrid, resigned his position the following week, citing a desire to return to private practice in his home territory. His resignation was accepted with administrative courtesy and no particular speed. 6 weeks passed. In those 6 weeks, Rowan began speaking in full sentences, short ones, provisionally, with the careful testing cadence of someone who has been silent long enough to be uncertain about the mechanics, how loud, how long, whether the response will be proportionate. then less provisionally. By the end of the second week, the nursemaid reported that he had developed strong opinions about the temperature of his porridge, and had communicated these opinions at volume and at some length. And when Vesna heard this, she sat in her new room with the window that fully closed, and felt something move through her chest that was not grief, and not precisely joy, but the particular warm certainty of having been right about something that mattered. He named the carved wolf in the third week. Vesna learned this from the steward's third clerk, who had heard it from the nursemaid, who had heard it from the boy himself, which was itself a sentence that would not have been possible 2 months prior. The wolf's name was Small Cormac. The Alpha King, upon receiving this intelligence, had a reaction that Vesna was not present to witness, but that was reported to her second-hand, as the expression of a man who has been ambushed by something he did not know he was vulnerable to, and is trying to work out the correct protocol for receiving it. She was given an official role, keeper of the nursery records and the medical archive, a position created in the language of institutional necessity, built from what the council had seen in the hearing room: the notebook, the dated entries, the cross-referenced evidence, the specific quality of attention that had done, quietly and without permission, what everything with permission had failed to do. Her room moved 2 floors up. It had a window that closed. It was a real room, the kind assigned to people who were categorized as people by the institution, and she moved her things into it in a single afternoon with the efficiency of someone who has not accumulated much. There were still council members who did not know what to do with her. One of them addressed her as the linen keeper in a full session 3 weeks after her appointment was formalized. Cormac said, without raising his voice, in the manner of a man clarifying a fact of record, "Her name is Vesna, and her title is the one I gave her." The council member wrote it down. He did not make the error again. Cormac began telling her things. This was not policy. It was not the briefing of a subordinate by a superior. It was the behavior of a man who had discovered, late and against expectation, that there was a person in his proximity who could receive information without it becoming a problem, who could hear about the Northern Road assessments or the complications with the Western Treaty without constructing a social implication from the hearing, who could listen to the entire story of his complicated relationship with the eldest council member without offering resolution or allegiance or commentary, who simply received what he told her and held it, and the holding was its own form of answer. He told her things the way he seemed to manage all his more important communications, matter-of-factly, as reports, offered alongside other work, as if the intimacy of the content were made bearable by the neutrality of the delivery. She came to understand that this was how he trusted, by offering information that cost him something, in the assumption that the recipient would know what it was worth and handle it accordingly. She always knew what to do with it. On a morning 6 weeks after the formal hearing, she came into the archive to find him already there. He had a map spread across the central table, a boundary survey of the Eastern Territories, large, requiring both hands to hold flat, which meant it required more than 2 hands if anything else was also happening. Rowan was on his knee, Small Cormac was on the corner of the table where Rowan had placed him upon arrival, because Rowan had recently developed the opinion that Small Cormac should be present at significant activities, and Rowan's opinions were, by this point, considered with appropriate seriousness. Cormac looked up when she entered. "I need a second pair of hands," he said. "The Eastern boundary notation." She put her notebook on the shelf and came around to the other side of the table. They worked for an hour. The archive was cold, and the candles burned low, and outside the slit windows the morning was gray and unhurried, and Rowan migrated from his father's knee to the hearthside rug in increments, carrying Small Cormac, and eventually fell asleep with the wolf tucked under his chin, in the particular way he had of sleeping, all at once, completely, as if sleep were a decision rather than a process. Neither of them moved him. She had both hands on the western edge of the map, holding it flat against the table's natural curl, and the boundary notation was finished, and they were both still looking at the map, because neither of them had decided to stop yet, when she said, "Why did you sign the petition?" It was not phrased as a question. She had learned this from him. He was quiet for a moment. He had the stillness of a man who understands that certain questions deserve the weight of being answered slowly, and has never felt the need to fill that weight with noise. "I didn't know what to do with something I couldn't explain," he said. She looked at the boundary notation, the eastern line, the careful precision of the survey. "That makes two of us," she said. Another pause. Rowan's breathing was steady. "The thread," Cormac said. "The amber thread. I checked the supply manifest after Heloise's account, before the petition hearing." She had known he would. She had known it from the second morning in the East Corridor, when he had looked at her with the quality of a man who has read something important and is now standing in front of its subject. "It was mine," she said. "I know," he said. "I read the manifest entry 4 times before I understood what it meant." He paused. "What it meant, that you had done it with your own materials, without telling anyone." She looked up at him. "3 times, he said. "I said 3 times earlier. It was 4. There was nothing to say after that, and then she said, "He named the wolf after you." "I am aware," the king said. He said it with the gravity of someone accepting a significant piece of intelligence, and with something underneath the gravity that was not quite a smile, but was the shape of what a smile felt like in a man who rarely let them have their full dimension. She looked at him. He looked at her. His wolf had been quiet for 6 weeks, not gone, but settled, the way a thing settles when it has arrived somewhere and found no further reason to pull. She was aware of it in the room, the way you are aware of a large, calm animal that has made a decision about you and is simply waiting for you to arrive at the same decision. It was not frightening. It was the opposite of frightening. It was the opposite of most things she had been prepared, by a long experience of being overlooked, to expect. He put his forehead against hers. She felt him exhale, slow, deliberate, the specific exhale of someone who has been carrying a particular weight for a long time and has finally arrived at the place where it is appropriate to set it down. She put her hand against his chest and felt his heartbeat under her palm, steady, heavy, unhurried, and outside the archive window, the morning bell was ringing the second hour, and neither of them moved toward it. The archive was quiet. Rowan slept on the hearthside rug. Small Cormac had the amber-stitched ear turned toward the light from the slit window. He kissed her on the forehead, the way someone keeps a promise. It was not remarkable now. Every morning the carved wolf sat on the archive's low shelf, positioned by Rowan himself, turned so the mended ear caught whatever light was available. Every morning Rowan checked the ear before he carried it anywhere, the way you check a repair that has become so reliable that the checking is no longer about doubt, but about ritual, the acknowledgement of something that has been cared for and is known. He spoke freely. He spoke often. He spoke at a volume that certain council members found, in enclosed chambers, an adjustment, and he spoke with the particular confidence of a child who has learned that his words are worth saying. He told Vesna about Small Cormac's opinions on the Eastern Territories. He told his father about the quality of the morning porridge. He told the youngest of the household gods, in complete sentences and at some length, that the god's horse was very large, and he would like to see it more frequently. The god arranged this. The horse proved to be a reliable subject for the boys' subsequent mornings. There were still council members who were uncertain about Vesna's precise position in the court's social grammar. The grammar had not been written yet for what she was, the woman the Alpha King had given a title to, who kept records in the archive and managed the royal nursery's medical documentation, and was, apparently, the person the Alpha King told things to. The grammar would be written eventually. It was being written in the ongoing sediment of daily life, at the pace of things that do not require announcement. She kept her notebook in her left pocket. She kept the thread, still the amber thread, still her own supply, though now listed properly in the castle's inventory under her name and role. She kept records. Cormac told her about the Northern Road assessments and the Western Treaty complications, and his theory about the eldest council member's unwillingness to revise his position on the border tax, which was, Cormac suspected, not actually about the border tax at all, but about something that had happened in the eldest council member's father's time, which the eldest council member had never addressed, and which therefore continued to inform every decision he made on the topic. She listened. She said when he had finished, "Have you asked him about his father's time?" He looked at her for a moment. He said, "No." She said, "That might be worth trying before the next session." He thought about it. He went to the next session having thought about it, and he came back from the session and said simply, "You were right." He said this in the way he said all things to her now, directly, as a report, the information offered without ceremony, in the assumption that she would know what to do with it. She always knew. In the archive that evening, with the boundary maps stored and the candles burned to their last inch, Rowan slept on her feet, where he had migrated from the hearthside rug sometime after midday, and Small Cormac sat on the low shelf within reach, and the king read from the Northern Survey, while she cross-referenced the boundary notations. And at some point, the reading and the cross-referencing paused, and neither of them said anything, and neither of them found this to be a problem. The impossible had been made ordinary. It had happened the way things that have waited 307 years eventually happen, not dramatically, not at ceremony, but morning by morning, in the working rooms of a castle that had a great deal of hierarchy, and one small archive with a window that faced east, and a shelf where a carved wolf's amber ear caught the light. A word at a time, a record kept, a thread from her own kit, mended without witness, because the work was worth doing, whether or not anyone wrote it down. She had written it down. She still had someone to give the notebook to. Do you believe that the things we repair quietly, without credit and without audience, eventually come back to the hands that fixed them? Or do you think the world keeps no record of that kind of work?